Hey everybody, it's Jason Cruz from MMA Payout. We are doing a little something different for you today. We are doing another interview on the East Coast, attending the Sports Lawyers Conference, which I typically try to do every year. And every year they have a student lawsuit writing competition, which basically is a student submits an essay or a little writing on something sports law related. And one of the honorees this year wrote about the UFC, and it's entitled Developments in NLRA Policy Provide UFC Athletes New Pathways to Representation. And it's by Zachary Tomlin of the University of San Francisco Law School, and he's been gracious enough to join me today. So, Zach, welcome to MMA Payout. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and it was so nice to meet you at the conference.
Yes, so I ran down Zach after the luncheon on Friday, and because I wanted to meet someone else who had interest in MMA. So Zach, let me ask you just briefly, what is your interest? How'd you get interested in MMA, and what are you doing as a law student at USF?
Well, I've been interested in MMA for a long time. I started watching in the early 2000s, around the time that Pride was on every Sunday or Saturday night. We watched it on Sunday. And, you know, even since then, I recognized that there was a lot of room for legal developments in the mixed martial arts world. And we've seen a lot of improvements in fighter conditions since then, but there's still, plenty of action going on. And so as far as what I'm doing at school, I'm entering my third year. I'm trying to extend my research on mixed martial arts a little bit as far as the legal context goes, and working towards passing the bar.
Always a very important thing if you want to be a lawyer, passing the bar. So let me ask you, tell us a little bit about the student writing competition and why you decided to enter it.
Well, I wanted to enter it because, I wanted some competition, really. It was something extra to take on to build skill. And, I was thinking that the mixed martial arts context was ripe. I was looking at some of the contractual restrictions with UFC, USADA, drug testing, the Reebok deal, and trying to, find a legal action. Well, after a little bit of research, this case presented itself, an NLRB, National Labor Relations Board case. For those who are uninitiated, the NLRB is an independent governmental entity which it was created to remedy differences in bargaining power between management and employees.
Correct, yes.
So I found that the NLRB was not covering fighters. So in the NFL, players have unions. In the NBA, players have unions. That's not so in mixed martial arts. And I tried to find out why. And something that's been discussed, what I found was that there was no union activity in mixed martial arts, though there were plenty of people trying to form unions. Mm-hmm. And a lot of this determination hinges on whether or not a fighter is an independent contractor or an employee. And while I could talk for hours on it, I don't want to dive directly into the 11-factor test.
Yeah, so one of the things that we see is a lot of our followers know that the UFC especially, there have been attempts to organize their fighters. And one of the issues is whether or not the fighters under contract with the UFC are considered employees or independent contractors. The UFC says has them designated as independent contractors. The NLRB issues opinions as to whether or not certain workers are classified correctly or misclassified. So we've seen this a lot, especially with the evolving what they call gig economy with software developers, Uber drivers, Amazon drivers, FedEx drivers. Those types of issues come into play as to whether or not they are employees or independent contractors. Why is that important? Mainly because there are a certain amount of benefits that they receive if they are considered employees. Correct. And so you Zach, your paper examined the validity of potential claims by UFC fighters, and one in particular, Leslie Smith. Correct.
Correct. So what my paper looked to do was to determine whether or not someone was in fact an independent contractor as they are treated by the UFC, or whether they were actually a de facto employee. Now, whether or not someone is a de facto employee determines it's determined by looking at 11 factors. It's a test where all factors are determined together, and no one factor is determinative. But a few of the notions that I found to be most important in my reading of the board's decisions were the extent of control, the existence of entrepreneurial opportunity, and whether or not a fighter was part of the UFC's regular business. So when the UFC has these restrictions on fighters that they have to abide by a dress code, they have to wear all Reebok gear. They cannot use their own sponsorships, independently acquired sponsorships, I should say. When there's a code of conduct that dictates what a fighter can do outside of the ring, when their marketing opportunities are largely controlled. Those are all factors that suggest that the UFC is able to exert a high degree of control, not to mention the USADA drug testing regimen or regime, which
it's very restrictive. It's very restrictive. And so just to back up a little bit, with this 11-part test, and we've not to give a plug, but Show Money also had gone into this, but there's an 11-factor test that the NLRB goes through in determining whether or not individual is an employee or independent contractor. Correct.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I've learned in my reading of this is that the test does not stress one or the other. Not one of the elements is stressed more than the other, and these factors are not inclusive in making the determination on whether or not an employee is an employee or an independent contractor. Correct?
Right.
So we have guidelines, just like the speed.
But and even in one of the decisions, and I don't have my research in front of me, one majority board member found that entrepreneurial opportunity was to be weighed more heavily.
Let's talk about the 11-factor test. We're talking about it's mainly guidelines more than it is a determinative issue. Correct?
Yeah, and there are problems. While there is a high degree of control that's taken on athletes by the UFC, there are a lot of problems when it comes to the NLRB, and I think those are most salient made most salient by looking at the Northwestern decisions of a couple of years ago. So in 2016, I believe, the Northwestern University college football team decided to organize and unionize in order to, be able to collectively bargain some of the conditions of their employment. Now, while the board, in reading their facts, found that there was an extremely high degree of control that was enacted over Northwestern football players, probably more than UFC athletes, in truth. While that was so, they were not going to extend their jurisdiction to cover just football players at Northwestern University when they were part of a larger, all-encompassing bargaining unit, which would be college football players. Now, in this context, the UFC is just one organization which exists within many organizations that employ mixed martial arts fighters, right? So that is a problem. Also, the bargaining unit changes quickly. These fighters have short career spans, and they can be 12 to 16 months, I think was an average that I read some time ago. And the board will look at that and say, how can we really represent a bargaining unit if it's always changing? And on top of that, even if Project Spearhead, which I suppose we'll address shortly, has success in the Smith case, there are going to be a lot of practical challenges to organizing and galvanizing a group that they need 30% of the bargaining unit to agree to be part of a union. And that's extremely challenging in a unit that has 600 members. They're spread all over the world, not just the country. So it's a problem.
So let's talk about that. But first, I wanted to circle back quickly regarding the Northwestern decision. Now, so it's my understanding that the NLRB found in favor of the Northwestern college football players, correct?
They found in favor initially that there was a degree of control and that they were entitled to recourse. But upon review, I'm not sure if it was an administrative law judge the first time or the second time. Upon review, the board decided that they weren't going to assert themselves into this matter because of those jurisdictional concerns. It was unlike any other place that they'd asserted themselves. In sports, they're involved with the NBA, the NHL, the NFL, but those represent cohesive bargaining units. The NFL, the NBA, they have a monopoly. So all of the players are represented. And additionally, they're all employees of teams. So in this context, the board may be extremely hesitant to get involved just because there isn't a lot of precedent in front of it.
Was it also because that Northwestern is a private college, not a public university? Was that another determining factor?
I believe it is. Don't quote me.
Okay.
But what I was focusing in on was primarily that difference in the bargaining unit. And we can fact check this.
Oh, that's no problem. That's no problem. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Project Spearhead. Now, this is essentially the big part of the article. We all know about the situation with respect to Leslie Smith and she being let go by the UFC after her contract was over, and the UFC essentially deciding on the night that her last fight was to take place, saying that you're done with the organization. We no longer want to sign you. And shortly thereafter, she files the charging letter with the NLRB. And she from what we understand from social media, she went and was testified before the NLRB, I believe, in Philadelphia, or one of the NLRB offices. We don't know what's going on right now at this point, but it's clear that a factor in the UFC not retaining her services is because of the fact of Project Spearhead, which she put together. And could you elaborate a little bit about Project Spearhead there for us, Zach?
Well, I think the Project Spearhead is, I mean, they've been the organization, I think, that's made the most tangible moves. And I think that if you are on the side of athlete unionization in the UFC, I think that is something you should be encouraged by. This latest occurrence where Ms. Smith was going to wear a Project Spearhead mouth guard and allegedly was let go, at least in part, due to that that threat to wear the mouth guard, or that announcement of intention, rather, to wear the mouth guard. If she was fired because of that, she will argue that that's a violation of her trying to unionize. It's protected concerted activity in the language of the act. Any activity to support your union, really anything. So the employee, or the putative employee, Ms. Smith in this case, is going to go in front of the board and say, "Hey, I'm an employee. I'm not an independent contractor, and as such, the UFC is violating all of your laws. Really, the very spirit of the act is gone against with their actions, and if they find in her favor, that will really open things up for Project Spearhead and for all the fighters, because at that point, all of the fighters are probably employees."
Okay, so again, for those who haven't followed the Leslie Smith story, in the charging letter, the letter which basically is sent to the NLRB and Zuffa, which designates a complaint about her not being her request for the NLRB to investigate the UFC, is that one, she started the Project Spearhead, which is the group that is seeking to obtain enough UFC signatures from UFC fighters to have the NLRB conduct a vote as to whether or not the contracted fighters want a union. One of the facts in the charging letter, as you said, Zach, was that in her last fight, which was it April? Her last, the last fight where she was supposed to fight Aspen Ladd, she had told the UFC she wanted to wear a mouthpiece that said across the front, Project Spearhead. So the ultimate visual for her is if she were to win, she would flash the mouthpiece, giving Project Spearhead a sort of a advertising, publishing. So obviously, we haven't talked about this, but yes, the UFC does not want a union or the fighters organized. They just don't. And so Leslie Smith does, and she has been really vocal about it. And according to the facts in the letter, the UFC wanted to reach out to her. There were some meetings that were supposed to be scheduled but never happened. And when Aspen Ladd, who was supposed to be her last opponent, did not make weight, she decided not to fight her at the catch weight that they were proposing. And as a result, she was, as we talked about, she was let go. And so you were talking about the investigation and the testimony taken by the NLRB. if the NLRB decides to exert the jurisdiction and finds and does an investigation of the UFC, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I think that if they, if you put aside any of those jurisdictional concerns, there is a great chance that the board, if they follow past decisions, despite those decisions coming in typically vastly different contexts, would find that these individuals are employees. The factors that suggest this are the drug testing, the Reebok deal, the code of conduct, their lack of control over their independent marketing, their lack of control over their selection of fights, and maybe even you could make an argument that their inability to well, I was going to say judging, but that's really not under the UFC's control either, though it is a huge problem.
Yeah.
So I think that if the board were to look and follow its past decisions, they would find that these athletes are not by any means independent contractors. An independent contractor is typically someone that you pay to do a job, and you let them go and do it. And that was typically the way that it was before. Maybe, I don't know what the line of demarcation was. Maybe it was the $4 billion sale that came along with the Reebok deal. But at some point, these fighters went from being athletes that had their own brand, had their own schools that they would pitch, their own banners that they would hang, their own endorsement deals that they would negotiate, to people in uniform subject to extreme control. And I think it's a good chance that these fighters are de facto employees, whether or not it gets that far.
And so what do you think that should the fighters do then? If the NLRB, if the NLRB doesn't do anything, or they just do not find that, based on the Smith investigation, that that the fighters are not independent contractors, or that they just don't find it in her case, what do you think the fighters should do? Should they still organize? Should they determine to set up an association? What would be the best outlet for that?
Well, if the fighters do, if they do fail, they've got to continue to go after it. There's the labor route, this unionization notion. There's also the antitrust route, which is being pursued right now by a different organization of athletes. And I suppose if they fail, yeah, they probably reorganize, redouble back, maybe wait for a new administration to come into office that may be more friendly to unions than to management. But yeah, it's a good question. And I suppose whatever they do, they should do it cohesively, which is an extreme challenge.
So I think one of the issues that I see, and maybe you could chime in here, is that there is a lack of central cohesiveness between the fighters. And obviously it's easy to think, and it's easy to figure out why, because the fighters fight each other. I mean, that's not it's not hard to think that you have 600 or so fighters, and it wouldn't be surprising that half the fighters hate the other half of the fighters or whatnot. But you touched on this a little bit before. There are so many obstacles in organizing fires, because you have them all over the world, different languages, different cultures, different philosophies. How do you think these fighters can galvanize to collaborate and come up with some sort of system in which way they could bargain with the UFC?
Well, I think that one way to really, you gotta harness your bargaining power if you have it. And as a unit, the power of the fighters is probably found in the top guys. And this is all theory, but if you get Conor McGregor, Miocic, RDA, some of the guys who are at the top of the cards, to actually say, hey, we're not going to do this unless we have a union, then you've got yourself a good shot. But the guys at the top are treated really fairly well, and like you said, there isn't a lot of unity in this giant unit. So it would take something very special. I think that what they could do is go to someone outside. Those practical problems are tough, and there's also the problem of allegiances. And so if there is a successful effort, I imagine that it would be led by someone with a ton of credibility and experience in unions outside of mixed martial arts.
It's just very hard for that to happen. I mean, we had George St. Pierre and Cain Velasquez with MMAAA, and I'm not sure if they're still around, but they thought they were going to. I mean, and that was a solid group with GSP, but since he's kind of come back or whatnot, that talk of that has kind of gone down. Same with TJ Dillashaw. He was supposed to be a part of that as well. And then you had former baseball agent trying to do this similar thing.
Boris.
Boris. I mean, his agency.
Jeff Boris.
And, Jeff Boris, and I think he is no longer pursuing that simply because he couldn't get enough traction. It seems like it's a very hard.
You can't have 4 different unions, right?
Yeah.
A union is one, and that's a problem. And I think that there's probably some ideological differences between the major unions, and again those allegiances. It's so difficult to conceive the possibility of them getting 30% to sign on. And just for the record, 30% of the representative bargaining unit must sign on to a union in order for that union to be certified and protected by the NLRA.
So that seems like a huge hurdle. And so we did talk a little. We didn't talk about the Velox case. Did you want to talk a little bit about that? You touched on that in your paper as well.
Yeah. So the Velox case. In this case, there was a shipping company which employed drivers and told drivers that they were independent contractors and not employees. That went in front of the board, and the board found no, in fact, these people are employees, based largely on the degree of control, the existence of outside opportunity for them, etc. However, Velox continued to tell its drivers that they can't be represented by a union and that they were independent contractors. And the board looked at that and said, well, the simple fact that you're telling an individual that is a de facto employee that they are not a de facto employee and they can't be represented by a union, that by itself is a violation of Section 8A1 of the act and is an unfair labor practice. Now, this is significant because even without a bargaining unit to protect all of the fighters, they can still seek, some kind of recourse through the NLRB or through the NLRA because they are employees and are labeled independent contractors. And that's the significance of the Smith case. So if that goes well, it could be very seismic, I think, as far as shifts go. One thing that I did want to address was in the last Show Money episode, I believe it was John, who suggested, the UFC kind of yield to a union because that would be a great PR move. And I actually think that is kind of right on. It would be a great PR move, but there's no way at all that, unless they really were convinced that, the board was going to find against them, there's no way that they would not oppose it vehemently. Now, if there was a union that was supported by the UFC, I do think it would be wonderful for them in the long run because it would legitimize them. It would provide some analog to other leagues. It would allow the UFC to act more like a league, which sort of seems like what they do. It's not like boxing. These fighters seem like they're the property of a league.
Yeah. So if you, as you suggest, the UFC yields to some sort of association or union, would that be a way to end the antitrust lawsuit? Because that would essentially moot the claims.
Yeah, these two issues are very intimately connected. If a union is certified, then what happens is on the antitrust side, they say, well, this organization is exempted from antitrust litigation. Antitrust generally it tries to stop monopolies, right? So the NFL is exempted from antitrust litigation because they have what's called a non-statutory labor exemption. And what that means is because the bargaining unit and management are cohesive and are bargaining all of the terms and conditions of their employment, that is sufficient to...
You got it.
To invalidate this monopoly power, right?
Yeah, because what you've seen in the past when there are labor issues in these leagues is what happens. They decertify the union and then they file an antitrust lawsuit. That's the play. But like you said, the MLB and NBA, they have these antitrust labor exemptions because they have bargaining units that will work on behalf of the players. So they have players union. The players union is representing all of the players in any sort of issue or grievance related to the league. So I think that this is something that the UFC will have to deal with sooner than later, or maybe dependent on this antitrust lawsuit, later than sooner. But again, I think that your paper, which was really well written, it kind of delves into these issues related to how the NLRB has dealt with independent contractor and employee issues. In my opinion, and based on what you've already indicated, seems like it could go either way, just because the precedent is no precedent.
Yeah, it's the wild, wild west, and hopefully some order comes to it. I mean, unless there's a favorable decision for Project Spearhead, no order will be there, and it'll just continue to be banging their head against the wall, maybe. But I'm confident that the future is bright for athletes to get, you know, more equal power. Something's got to give.
Well, I think one of the things that we have seen is incrementally that there are fighters that are speaking out about these issues. And with the new media deal going to ESPN, we may see more and more of this happening, in which these issues will come to light, and there'll be some movement, either through the Leslie Smith case, either through the antitrust exemption, either through something we haven't talked about, the Muhammad Ali Expansion Act, or through the other organizations that are trying to organize fighters. So Zach, do you have a Twitter handle or anything that people can, if you are available, or what are your plans? Are you looking to stay in the California area?
I don't have a Twitter because, I mean, how much?
You save money. Yeah. I mean, you save time.
It comes out of Twitter. It's all bad. And as far as where I'm going to be and what I'm going to be doing with my career, well, that is the great mystery. But as far as what you can see from me, I'm working on extending my research, and hopefully you'll see me published in some sports law journal that 17 people will read in the future.
Yeah, that's 16 more than me.